Welcome back to the deep dive. You know that moment when you realize the history you thought you knew might only be, well, half the story?
hmm
Today, we are opening a pretty contentious stack of sources, stuff that dives headfirst into that uncomfortable reality.
Yeah, this material is positioned explicitly as a radical counter-narrative. It's framed as a comprehensive defense of the South regarding, the central conflict in American history, the Civil War.
Right. And the core premise, it seems, is this quote they use, attributed to Confederate Major General Patrick Cleburne in 1864.
That's the one. The idea that history is written entirely by the winner, the enemy, as he put it, and that the defendants, the South, well, they never really got to make their case.
So the source material we're looking at today sets out to present that missing defense.
Exactly.
And our mission, as always, is to impartially unpack the claims made in these documents. I mean, this deep dive challenges almost every common assumption you might hold.
It really does. It draws on a huge collection of primary sources, foreign observations, economic data. It's quite extensive.
So we're going to explore claims about the true nature of slavery, the foundational constitutional reasons for secession, and, well, whether the Union victory ultimately preserved freedom or actually destroyed the founding concept of a decentralized republic.
It's definitely contentious ground.
No kidding.
Yeah.
But we're committed to just walking straight through the arguments presented in the source. And we start right where the source material dictates, diving into their claims about the institution of slavery itself.
Okay, so the author begins this section with a very deliberate methodological choice. They state upfront that their intent is not to defend slavery as an institution,
All right.
or even to deny the existence of its brutality. They actually acknowledge that horrific evils, things like torture, rape, murder, occurred. They even cite testimony from the Federal Writers Project slave narratives.
There's a but coming, isn't there?
There is. They explicitly choose not to quote those examples. Their reasoning is that those instances, while real, were the exception, not the rule.
That's a fascinating, if maybe aggressive, methodological choice right there.
It is.
They're basically saying, we know the horror exists, but since that's the only story usually told, we're only going to give the counterpoint. Is that fair?
That's precisely it. Their stated goal is to give an accurate historical portrayal to counter what they call Republican propaganda. And they do that by only providing, quote, the side of slavery that is not given to the public.
Which lets them focus solely on the alleged material benefits and the comparative well-being of the enslaved population according to their narrative.
Exactly. Hashtag tech hat 1.1 conditions and economic status of the enslaved, the source's claims.
Okay, let's unpack this counter-narrative then, starting with the welfare and workload. The source claims slaves were generally well-fed, well-cared for, even treated much like extended family members. How do they even begin to argue that?
Well, it relies heavily on comparative statistics and also observations from outside witnesses. The core argument is that enslaved people often fared better materially than, say, free blacks or even northern industrial workers at the time.
Better materially, how so?
So, for instance, the source pulls specific data points from that controversial 1974 study, Time on the Cross, by Fogel and Engerman.
Vaguely, yes. Very controversial.
Right. And based on that, they assert that slaves worked approximately 10% fewer hours than northern farmers.
10% fewer hours. Wow. Okay, that is a surprising statistic.
It is. It relates to the agrarian calendar, you see.
Okay.
The source calculates that because of required holidays, time off for sickness, and observing the Sabbath, slaves averaged only about 281 working days a year.
Okay.
They point to observations, like one from a northerner named Joseph Ingram, who noted that between Christmas and New Year's, there were several days where the enslaved were, quote, quite at liberty to dance and frolic.
So the argument boils down to economic incentive for the master.
Pretty much. Keep your human capital healthy and, well, reasonably content. They contrast this sharply with a northern factory owner who could just fire and replace an exhausted wage laborer with little direct cost.
Right. And beyond just basic welfare, the source material pushes a really highly controversial economic claim, something about slaves accumulating wealth.
Yeah.
And keeping a portion of their productivity.
Yes, this is one of their biggest claims, actually, financial compensation. They quote a former slave owner, Daniel Hundley, who claimed that an adult male slave could save more ready money in a 12-month than most D-laborers in the North.
More ready money. That seems improbable.
Well, this relates back to Time on the Cross. Based on their calculations of maintenance costs, housing, food, medical care, clothing, Fogel and Engerman asserted the typical slave received about 90% of the income they produced.
90%. Yeah, I remember that statistic caused an absolute uproar when that study came out because it implies the system wasn't nearly as economically extractive as, commonly believed.
It does, and the source really seizes on that statistic. They draw a direct comparison, claiming the enslaved person kept a higher percentage of their produced income than, say, modern Americans do.
How do they make that comparison?
They cite modern taxes and regulations, arguing that federal and state governments today, quote, confiscate 35% of a worker's time and money.
Hmm.
They even offer anecdotes, like a former Alabama slave named Simon Phillips, who apparently lent his master money when the master was, quote, hard pushed, to illustrate, accumulated personal savings.
Okay, but let's turn to the necessary violence of the system. The source has to address the obvious brutality, the legal reality of being property. How do they handle discipline and legal protections?
They argue that laws actually protected slaves, both as property and as people. They stress the master's self-interest, again, treat them well to maintain their value.
Okay, but what specific laws?
They cite Virginia law and court cases,
Hmm.
for example, showing that slaves were granted equal protection against rape as white women. And crucially, they cite laws that apparently recognize the slave's right to defend themselves.
Defend themselves. Against whom? The master.
Yes, including, the source claims, the right to kill a master in self-defense if the master inflicted, quote, cruel and unusual punishment.
Wait a second. If the source is claiming corporal punishment was rare, how do they square that with the need for laws granting slaves the right to kill a master in self-defense? That suggests a pretty severe threat level must have existed, right?
That's exactly the internal tension the source has to navigate. Their argument is that while corporal punishment was, inherent to the system's structure, it wasn't the accepted norm for daily management.
So, more of a last resort.
According to them, they lean on Fogel and Engerman again, noting most plantation manuals supposedly discouraged or strictly limited whipping. They favored positive reinforcement, like bonuses or land plots for good work.
Hmm.
They argue the punishment system, when used sparingly, was merely to correct behavior and discourage crime. They quote a northerner, Nehemiah Adams, who visited the South and found Negro crime, quote, almost non-existent, suggesting the system was, quote, most favorable to preservation from crimes against society.
And who was actually administering this punishment when it did happen?
That's another interesting point they make. The source claims that on larger farms, the person actually administering the whip was overwhelmingly a black overseer, often called a driver.
Really? How common?
They claim 75% of overseers were black, which, if true, shifts the internal narrative somewhat. It suggests the day-to-day discipline wasn't solely a racialized system imposed by white authority, but maybe a more complex management structure within the plantation hierarchy itself.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit to intellectual and spiritual life. The source also contests the idea that slaves were, universally kept illiterate and oppressed in that way.
Correct. They make the case that masters actually desire their servants to be intelligent and moral. Why? Again, because this increased their value.
Makes cold economic sense, I suppose. Examples.
They cite places like Jefferson Davis's plantation, where slaves were apparently given significant managerial responsibility. And Stonewall Jackson's famous Sunday school, which openly taught literacy to large numbers of black people.
But weren't there laws against teaching slaves to read?
Yes, the source acknowledges those laws, especially after events like the Nat Turner Uprising. But they claim these laws were often privately ignored by masters, who prioritized the economic and maybe spiritual benefits of having literate workers.
And the spiritual life itself. The source presents it as, well, remarkably unifying, rather than divisive.
Indeed.
Mm.
They paint a picture where many slaves were profoundly Christian, often worshiping right alongside their masters, sometimes even forming the core of local congregations.
Really? Worshiping together.
That's the claim. Joseph Ingraham is quoted again, describing a baptismal scene: white, black, yellow, rich, poor, freeman, slave, all apparently dipping in the same font. He called it a beautiful emblem of the undistinguishing blood of the Savior.
Hmm.
And this is contrasted with observations from figures like Alexis de Tocqueville, who noted, maybe counterintuitively, that racial prejudice actually seemed stronger in the northern states that had already abolished slavery than the southern states where it still existed.
Mm-hmm.
Hashtag tag 1.2 Black Loyalty and the critique of abolitionist portrayals.
Okay, so if the conditions were, in this specific view presented by the source, comparatively favorable, they still have to address the clear desire of many enslaved people for freedom and, the massive abolition movement.
Right. They address the desire for freedom by arguing it wasn't universal. Not everyone wanted it, according to them.
Oh, they argue that.
They cite some former slave interviews, claiming thousands actually mourned emancipation and even refused freedom, finding life harder after the war, lack of care, skyrocketing crime, that sort of thing.
That's a very challenging claim, evidence.
Well, they point to a North Carolina law that apparently allowed free blacks to choose a master of good repute. They use this as evidence that the desire to return to some form of servitude or mentorship was perhaps common among free black communities struggling economically. They quote a former slave, Henry Brown, who claimed, quote, "We had it better then than now, cause white men lynch and burn now, and do other things they couldn't do then." The core claim is that race relations deteriorated severely after the war because of new economic competition, political instability.
And they go even further than that, right? Claiming significant black support for the Confederacy during the war itself.
Yes. Citing historian Irvin Jordan, the source asserts tens of thousands of Southern blacks, both free and enslaved, actually supported the Confederate cause.
Tens of thousands supporting the Confederacy.
That's the claim. They provide anecdotes, free blacks volunteering cash and services. A former slave named Alice Bow describing slaves singing, "We'll hang Abe Lincoln on the sour apple tree."
Wow.
They point to documented instances of free men of color in Virginia and South Carolina volunteering for state service, maybe even fighting in battle. The source uses all this to argue that the war wasn't uniformly perceived by black Americans as a war purely for their liberation.
Which leads directly into the source's critique of how the North, and Europe for that matter, perceived slavery. Basically through the lens of political fiction.
Exactly. The critique of Uncle Tom's Cabin is absolutely central here.
Right. So I'll guess too.
The source argues Northern and European perceptions were based on this highly emotional fiction, not first-hand observation. Harriet Beecher Stowe, they point out, had never actually been to the South.
Okay.
So her book, published in 1852, is dismissed not as history, but as a, quote, politically motivated anti-fugitive slave law work.
And they try to bolster this assertion how?
By using quotes from Northern observers who were genuinely surprised by what they found when they actually went south during the war.
Like who, specifically? Any names?
They cite Nehemiah Adams again, and notably, Union officer Charles Francis Adams, Jr., the son of Lincoln's minister to Britain.
Adams Jr., a Union officer, what did he say?
He wrote home in 1864, apparently shocked. He said, quote, "The conviction is forcing itself upon me that African slavery, as it existed in our slave states, was indeed a patriarchal institution, under which the slaves were not, as a whole, unhappy, cruelly treated, or overworked."
That's quite a statement from a Union officer.
It is, and the source uses these kinds of testimonials to suggest the reality on the ground, at least for some, contradicted the abolitionist propaganda circulating at the time.
And finally, on this section about slavery, the source brings up the existence of black slave owners, just to further complicate the simple racial and economic narrative.
Right, this point adds a layer of complexity that I think many listeners might not be aware of. Citing Larry Koger, the source notes the 1830 census recorded over 10,000 free men of color who owned slaves.
10,000 free black slave owners.
Yes, including some who were among the wealthiest planters in the Confederacy. They give specific examples, like Augustinato in Louisiana, a free-colored planter who owned 70 slaves, or William Ellison in South Carolina, who used 70 slaves on his cotton plantation. And the source emphasizes these black masters apparently used the same economic and disciplinary practices as white masters, and often held onto their slaves until forced by the federal government to release them after the war.
Which really challenges that monolithic narrative of slavery as exclusively a white-on-black institution.
That's precisely the point the source is trying to make here.
Okay, that is a staggering amount of material, all dedicated to revising the history of slavery. But the source is very clear, isn't it? Even if you accepted all those claims, the real defense of the Confederacy, in their view, doesn't actually rest there.
Exactly. The source argues slavery wasn't even the core reason the South left the Union.
Which seems like the central question they pose.
It is, they ask. If the South could have preserved slavery by simply laying down arms, and they reinforce this point by citing Lincoln's early offers and the text of the Emancipation Proclamation, which explicitly exempted loyal slave states.
Right, the border states.
Exactly. If they could have kept slavery, why did they continue to fight a devastating war for 4 long years?
So this forces a pivot in their argument.
Absolutely. The source argues slavery was merely the occasion of the strife, the sort of flashpoint issue. But the true cause was deeper, a foundational dispute over government structure. specifically states' rights and economic plunder.
Okay, let's unpack this shift because here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The constitutional dispute. What was the Southern view of the Union versus the Northern view, according to this source material?
So the source outlines two fundamentally irreconcilable visions of the Republic.
Okay.
The Southern view, which they labeled the Jeffersonian Compact Theory, apparently dominated American politics from about 1800 to 1856.
The compact theory, what does that mean exactly?
It means the Union was seen as a voluntary compact, like a contract, between sovereign states. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. So the federal government was strictly limited. It was merely an agent of the states with only delegated restricted powers. And crucially, if the agent exceeded its bounds, the sovereign states believed they had the right of nullification or, ultimately, secession.
The right to leave the contract, basically.
Precisely. Now, the Northern view, or what became the Republican view, was the exact opposite, according to the source. The nationalist view.
Nationalist meaning?
Meaning the government was a centralized nation. Sovereignty rested ultimately with the federal authority, not the states. And this meant a simple national majority could dictate policies to dissenting states.
Which the South called
A tyranny of the unbridled majority. They saw this as a complete overthrow of the original constitutional design, replacing the idea of consent with raw central authority.
And the Confederate Constitution itself, then, was drafted as a direct response to this perceived overthrow.
Absolutely. The CSA Constitution is presented here not as some radical new document, but as a reactionary revolution, meaning it aimed at restoring the decentralized principles of the 1789 Republic that they felt had been corrupted by the North. Jefferson Davis is quoted claiming the CSA Constitution was essentially the original U.S. Constitution, just with, quote, improvements designed to prevent those Northern abuses.
And the language reflects that.
Very much so. The preamble is key. It explicitly emphasizes state sovereignty, stating the people are acting, quote, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character.
So the CSA Constitution tried to codify limitations they felt the old U.S. Constitution hadn't enforced strongly enough. What specific mechanisms did they put in place to prevent that centralization and corruption they saw in Washington?
Well, they included several measures you might call libertarian or fiscally strict today.
Such
They
as?
banned corporate subsidies, bailouts, and federal funding for internal improvements, like railroads, that they felt favored one state or region over another.
Okay.
The president was granted a line-item veto on spending bills. They saw that as critical for fighting corruption and preventing, pork barrel spending.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah. Congress was required to handle each appropriation bill separately to avoid those huge omnibus bills where, the South felt, favors for Northern interest groups were often hidden.
Right.
And get this, the post office was even required to be self-sufficient after a certain date, reflecting their insistence that government functions shouldn't just rely on endless taxation to run inefficiently.
So all designed to enforce fiscal responsibility and stop federal power being used to enrich one section of the country at the expense of another.
That was the stated goal, yes.
But okay, these constitutional fights, they often boil down to money, don't they?
Often, yes.
And the source argues that the real driver of secession wasn't just theoretical constitutional disagreement, but actual economic plunder, enforced primarily through tariffs.
This is a major structural argument in the source material. They cite scholars like Thomas DiLorenzo who argued tariffs were the leading cause.
How did that work, according to them?
Well, before the war, the federal government got almost all its money from tariff taxes on imported goods.
Right, no income tax yet.
Exactly. Now, the South was overwhelmingly agrarian. They were primarily consumers of manufactured goods. So those tariffs forced them to pay higher prices for European imports.
While the North.
The North was industrial. They benefited immensely because the tariffs protected their industries, mines, factories from cheaper foreign competition.
So essentially, the North was using federal law to create a captive market for its own goods, funded by Southern consumers paying higher prices. Is that the claim?
That's exactly the source's claim, that the South was being systematically exploited economically. And this conflict wasn't new.
No.
They cite the Tariff of Abominations back in 1828. Apparently, it was so discriminatory that only 1 out of 105 Southerners voted for it. It forced South Carolina to seriously contemplate nullification and secession decades before the war.
So it shows the economic conflict was chronic, not just something that suddenly flared up in 1860.
Right. And what was the final economic trigger, according to the source, that pushed that first wave of states out?
Yeah.
The Morrill Tariff of 1861. passed right before Lincoln took office. It hiked taxes on imports to a massive 47%.
47%. Wow.
Yeah. The source views this as the absolute final act of economic plunder. They even claim that the Confederate forces targeting Fort Sumter weren't just going after a military installation, but specifically the U.S. Customs House there.
The building where they collected the tariffs?
The very mechanism used to enforce these hated taxes, exactly. Hashtag tag 2.3 Lincoln and the rise of the centralized party.
Okay, so beyond the economics, the source also frames the rise of Lincoln and the Republican Party itself as like a revolutionary event, something that changed the very nature of American governance.
They definitely do. They describe the Republican Party as novel, foreign, and essentially a revolutionary party.
Pretty foreign. How so?
They claim the party was structurally bolstered by the massive influx of European immigrants, specifically citing socialist and centralist thinkers who arrived after the failed European revolutions of 1848. These immigrants, the source argues, brought Marxist ideas like mandatory government-run education and a centralist philosophy, which the Republicans then adopted to gain national power where they previously had none.
That's quite a claim about the origins of the Republican Party.
It is. And how did the South perceive Lincoln's election in 1860, given that he won with only, 39% of the total popular vote?
Yeah, a plurality, not a majority.
Right. His victory was seen, according to the source, as a complete overthrow of representative government. Because the Republican platform was explicitly sectional focused almost entirely on Northern economic interests and blocking the expansion of the Southern system.
So the South felt.
They viewed themselves as becoming, quote, servants to a foreign national party. They believed the checks and balances designed to protect the minority section, their section, had totally failed, leaving them at the mercy of this centralist, tariff-hungry majority.
And the election itself, therefore, triggered the secession of those first 7 cotton states, even before Lincoln was inaugurated.
That's how the source presents the sequence of events, yes. Okay, so we connect this to the bigger picture. The Deep South, states like South Carolina, Mississippi. They had these economic and constitutional reasons to leave, according to the source. But it's the response of the Upper South states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, that the source argues reveals the fatal rupture, the break in the core principle of the Union consent.
Right, because the Upper South had been generally more unionist, hadn't they? So why were they suddenly galvanized to secede? What was the tipping point for them? Hashtag 3.1 Lincoln's call for troops.
The timing is crucial here, and it demonstrates the source's point. The original 7 cotton states left before Lincoln's inauguration.
Right.
But the Upper South initially rejected secession, or their conventions voted against secession ordinances. The overwhelming sentiment, the source claims, was actually unionist right up until April 1861.
So what happened in April?
The turning point was Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. To do what? To coerce the seceded states back into the Union.
And this was viewed not just as military action, but as, well, as an invasion, a fundamental constitutional violation.
Absolutely. The Southern view, as presented here, was that the Union was a compact based on consent, not force.
Okay.
The source leans heavily on warnings from the Founding Fathers themselves. They quote Federalist Alexander Hamilton, ironically, often seen as a centralizer who apparently argued forcefully against federal military coercion of states.
Hamilton argued against it.
Yes, calling it, quote, one of the maddest projects that was ever devised. Why? Because it transforms the Union from a voluntary compact into a military despotism. That's Hamilton's alleged warning used by the source.
And the reaction in Virginia seems to be the perfect example of this sudden shift.
It was incredibly dramatic. Virginia had initially passed an anti-coercion resolution by a huge margin, like 112 to 5.
Right.
They were against forcing the Deep South back.
But then Lincoln called for troops?
And Virginia flipped almost instantly. The source cites detailed records from a historian named Crofts on Rockbridge County, a previously staunch Unionist area. Upon hearing Lincoln's call, they reportedly threw down their American flagpole and voted 1,728 to 1 for secession.
Wow, 1,728 to 1.
Yeah. Even Virginia's governor, John Letcher, who apparently wanted Virginia to abolish slavery eventually, became a firm secessionist overnight. Why? Because he declared he could not abide the federal government invading a sovereign sister state.
So the principle of state sovereignty, not necessarily slavery itself, became the immediate rallying cry for the Upper South.
That's the argument the source makes very strongly. Hashtag 3.2, the importance of states' rights over slavery.
And this evidence then reinforces the source's core argument that the conflict, at least for the Upper South, became fundamentally about preventing military coercion and preserving states' rights, not primarily about preserving slavery at that specific moment.
Right. The source tries to reinforce this by using comparative statistics on slaveholding demographics.
Okay.
They note that Arkansas, which voted 65-5 for secession after Lincoln's call for troops, only had about 20% slave-owning households.
Okay.
Yet Kentucky, which famously remained Union throughout the war, actually had a higher percentage, 23% slave-owning households. North Carolina, which only seceded after the call, had 27%.
So the argument is,
The argument is clear. If secession was solely about protecting slavery, Kentucky should logically have seceded before Arkansas or North Carolina, but they didn't.
and they also cite Confederate leaders themselves, right? People who were apparently willing to sacrifice slavery for the cause of independence later in the war.
Yes. They mention General Patrick Cleburne, a dedicated Confederate officer
Yeah.
who actually proposed freeing all slaves and arming them to fight for the Confederacy.
Freeing and arming slaves by a Confederate general.
That's the claim. And they also cite Jefferson Davis himself, who near the very end of the war apparently offered to end slavery entirely if it meant gaining foreign recognition from Britain and France. So, for the source, this proves that independence and the principle of self-governance were the ultimate objectives. Slavery, while a huge part of the Southern socioeconomic structure, was something the Confederacy was potentially willing to sacrifice to avoid what they saw as centralization and coercion.
The core issue being, if the federal government could force a sovereign state back into the Union militarily, then the whole principle of limited government was essentially dead.
That's the bottom line of their argument on this point, yes.
So, okay, wrapping all this together, what does it mean for the big picture? The source argues the Civil War was ultimately a clash between two fundamentally different civilizations. Is that right?
That's the deep cultural synthesis the source presents, the traditional, decentralized agrarian South versus the modern, centralized industrial North.
And they argue the war was inevitable because these two worldviews were just mutually exclusive.
Pretty much, yes. Hashtag tag 4.1, the agrarian life and liberty.
So tell us about the Southern ideal as the source defines it. What did that look like?
Well, it was modeled after a kind of traditional Jeffersonian agrarian society, emphasizing things like leisure, tradition, morality, a self-sufficient Christian atmosphere.
Right.
Crucially, the ideal was that men work to live, not live to work. This independence, the source argues, cultivated self-sufficiency, freedom of mind, making the populace resistant to state dependence.
The opposite of what they call
Urban collectivist mob, or the centralized factory worker who depends on the system.
right. And the source makes a very dramatic and frankly controversial critique here, drawing a brutal comparison between the life of the Southern planter they describe and the Northern industrial worker. They even use the term wage slavery.
They draw a very stark contrast between chattel slavery and what they call wage slavery.
Right.
They present the modern wage laborer as caught in this, quote, frantic, taxed, regulated existence, constantly checking the clock, commuting in traffic, totally dependent on a boss for income, paying high taxes. This industrial life, they argue, is just a new form of servitude. The worker's time isn't really his own. His money is taken by taxes and regulations.
And the worker becomes dependent on the state for everything: schooling, infrastructure, welfare.
Exactly. Creating a populace of compliant slaves of the state is how they put it.
Whereas the agrarian life they describe is leisurely, low tax, self-sufficient, debt-free.
That's the ideal presented, yes. Organic food, freedom to roam, low taxes, self-sufficiency. This agrarian system, they argue, was seen as fundamentally blocking the Republican agenda of high tariffs and corporate welfare. Why? Because it created an independent populace.
So the North had to crush the South.
According to this source, yes. Because the agrarian system impeded the progress of the machine. The centralized industrial system required dependent wage earners, not self-sufficient landholders. Hashtag 4.2, gender roles, education, and centralization. And this cultural clash, they argue, extends deeply into the societal structure itself, particularly around gender roles and education.
Okay, how does the source view the change in gender roles that was happening, driven by industrialization?
Well, they argue that in the South, motherhood and the home were protected by, quote, Christian chivalry, and seen as the most vital roles for women, essential for propagating that agrarian culture.
And feminism.
The source views the rise of feminism not as liberation, but as a movement pushed by industrialists, the capitalists, specifically to transform women into slave wage earners.
Why would industrialists want that?
The argument is it doubled the workforce, which drove down wages for men and ultimately destroyed the self-sufficient nuclear family unit, which the centralized state could then step in and replace, making people more dependent.
Wow. Okay. And state education. That's framed as the ultimate tool of centralization, almost like political indoctrination.
That is precisely the claim. They trace government-funded public education back to socialist influences, citing Marx and later American figures like Horace Mann and John Dewey.
And the purpose of this state education was?
To mold children to conform to the needs of the state and the industrialists, teaching them to work by the clock, sit still, tolerate monotony, essentially preparing them for factory life. Southern thinkers like R.L. Dabney are quoted warning that secular state education was designed to weed out heresy, meaning traditional beliefs, and would inevitably lead to atheism and, quote, the wildest communism, ultimately establishing a despotism over the mind by creating obedient wage laborers.
So the South, by maintaining its orthodox worldview-focused Christianity, saw itself as resisting these loathsome isms, socialism, communism, atheism, which they perceived as rampant in the industrial North.
That's the cultural line they draw. The war, in this view, was also fundamentally a religious conflict. Traditional Orthodox Christianity against what they saw as a wave of modern, secular, centralizing atheism. The moral culture of respect in the South was, in their eyes, what protected them from the chaos and crime of the industrial North. Hashtag 4.3 Lincoln's tyranny and the death of the Republic.
Okay, so this entire defense culminates in the source's final and really scathing assessment of Abraham Lincoln, portraying him not as the great savior, but as a dictator who permanently destroyed the original decentralized republic.
That's exactly right. The source holds Lincoln directly responsible for permanently installing Alexander Hamilton's centralized system. National debt, protected markets, collusion between bankers and politicians, federal supremacy over states, all the things the South feared.
And they list numerous alleged violations of the Constitution to back this up, to claim he acted like a dictator.
They do. They claim he exercised power almost as free from restraint as a dictator or a sultan. The list of alleged violations is pretty extensive.
What are the specific constitutional violations, they say?
Okay, well, they mentioned suspending habeas corpus, particularly in Maryland, imprisoning around 13,000 political enemies without charge or trial.
13,000.
That's the number they cite. Deporting Congressman Clement Vallandigham, who was a Northern critic of the war, just for criticizing the administration, closing down newspapers that opposed the war effort, invading states without their consent, and even rigging Northern elections through military voting procedures.
That's a heavy list of accusations.
It is. And the source argues these weren't just wartime necessities, but unforgivable actions that established a permanent precedent for executive overreach and military suppression of dissent. Actions that fundamentally broke the compact theory forever.
And the image of Lincoln as the great emancipator, that's challenged directly too, right? Using Lincoln's own historical statements on race.
Yes, the source challenges this image very directly. They cite Lincoln's consistent statements asserting his belief in white superiority and his lifelong support for racial separation through colonization, sending black people away.
They quote him.
They quote him directly from the Charleston debate in 1858. I am in favor of having this superior position assigned to the white race. They emphasize his statement that his first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia. The source argues that Lincoln and the Republicans actually aimed to keep black people, both free and slave, out of the Western territories. Why? To ensure the West remained a place where, quote, white labor was respectable and honorable. Prioritizing white economic interests over racial equality is their claim.
So the source concludes that the Union victory essentially ensured the triumph of that centralized, industrial, unlimited democracy the South feared so much.
That is the ultimate and very grave conclusion they reach. The defeat of the Confederacy destroyed the Southern vision of a limited, decentralized republic. The North's vision of a centralized, unlimited democracy was installed by force.
Ensuring the rule of the majority and the interests of powerful industrial and banking classes.
Right. What they call the awesome power of our federal master. This centralization, the source argues, is the root cause of many problems today. Rampant federal regulation, politicians acting above the law, the absurdity of local life being governed by distant federal mandates.
So in their view, the Civil War was effectively the death of true American liberty as originally conceived.
That's the stark conclusion presented in this material. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, okay. This deep dive really forces you, the listener, to confront the core tension running through all this material. That clash between a decentralized compact theory where power is limited and local and a centralized democracy, where power is potentially limitless and subject to the changing will of a national majority.
Mm-mm. And the cultural conflict, between tradition and agrarian life versus modernity and industrialization. The source presents that as a powerful symptom of that deeper existential constitutional dispute.
Yeah, the source concludes, pretty undeniably from their perspective, that the Civil War destroyed the core principle of the consent of the governed, replacing it with a tyranny of numbers that forces compliance through coercion.
Right. The author states quite plainly that the defeat of the Confederacy was a catastrophic blow to the idea of self-governance.
But the author leaves us with one final and maybe provocative thought, something that builds on their argument about liberty predating the Confederacy itself.
Yes, they express a kind of hope, actually. A hope for a future defined by a return to true self-governance, where America might ultimately be divided into, well, thousands of diverse self-governing
Well,
countries.
thousands, like hyperlocalism.
Exactly. The argument is that people should be allowed to cluster together and let live under the laws and culture they genuinely choose for themselves, rather than being forced to conform by a centralizing power that dictates morality, economics, education, everything.
This, the author argues, is the only path to true diversity, real political choice and self-determination at the most local level possible.
That's the final thought they leave us with.
Whether such radical decentralization is even possible or desirable, or whether the centralized structure Lincoln championed is now just the permanent reality. Well, that's the ultimate question left for you to mull over after this deep dive.